The smallest decisions often change the biggest lives. Most people never realize it when the moment happens. I certainly did not. The train was packed that evening. Every seat was taken. Every aisle was crowded. The city outside the windows glowed beneath a cold Chicago sunset, while hundreds of exhausted people tried to make it home after another long day. I stood near the center of the train, one hand wrapped around a metal pole, my backpack hanging from one shoulder. My feet hurt. My shoulders hurt. My entire body felt tired. I had spent 8 hours at the bookstore before rushing across town to pick up medication for my father. It had been one of those days that seemed determined to last forever. Around me, people stared at their phones. Some listened to music. Others looked out the windows without really seeing anything. Nobody spoke. Nobody smiled. Everyone appeared trapped inside their own thoughts. Then the train stopped at the next station. The doors opened. More passengers stepped inside. Among them was an elderly woman. She looked to be somewhere in her late 70s. Maybe older. She carried 2 grocery bags that seemed heavier than they should have been. Her gray hair was neatly arranged. Her coat looked worn from years of use. I watched her step onto the train and immediately search for a place to sit. There were none. The train started moving again. The sudden motion caused her to stumble slightly before she caught herself. Several people noticed. Nobody moved. Nobody looked away either. They simply returned to their screens. I do not know why that bothered me as much as it did. Maybe because she reminded me of my grandmother. Maybe because she looked exhausted. Maybe because kindness always feels urgent when nobody else is offering it. Whatever the reason, I stood up. "Ma'am," I called gently. She turned toward me. "Please take my seat." Surprise crossed her face. "Oh no, dear. You do not have to do that." I smiled. "I really do." After a moment, she accepted. I helped her with the grocery bags and waited until she sat down comfortably. Her eyes softened. "Thank you." "You are welcome." That was it. The entire interaction lasted less than a minute. The woman settled into the seat. I returned to standing. The train continued moving. Most people forgot about it immediately. So did I. At least I thought I did. What I did not realize was that someone had been watching the entire thing. Several rows away, seated near the back of the train, a man lowered the newspaper he had been reading. Vincent Romano rarely used public transportation. On most days, he traveled with drivers, assistants, schedules, and responsibilities that seemed endless. But that evening, a last-minute meeting downtown had disrupted his plans. The train happened to be the fastest option available. Normally, he would have spent the ride reviewing documents. Normally, he would not have paid attention to strangers. Yet his eyes followed the young woman who had given away the only empty seat. Not because she was trying to impress anyone. Not because she wanted recognition. The opposite, actually. The moment the elderly woman sat down, the young woman simply disappeared back into the crowd. No smile of self-congratulation. No expectation of praise. No attempt to attract attention. She behaved as though kindness was the most ordinary thing in the world. Vincent found that unusual, because in his experience the rarest thing in any city was not power. It was sincerity. The train rolled through another station. Then another. The young woman eventually stepped off and disappeared into the crowd outside. Vincent remained seated. For reasons he could not explain, his eyes continued searching the platform long after she was gone. And for the first time in a very long time, he found himself wondering about someone he had never met. Most people would have forgotten her by the next morning. Vincent did not. He arrived at his office before sunrise, as he always did. The city below was still waking up. Streetlights glowed against damp pavement. Traffic moved in slow streams beneath the glass walls of his building. Assistants arrived. Meetings filled his calendar.
Phones rang.
Documents waited for signatures. Yet every time he paused, he found himself thinking about the young woman from the train. Not because she had done something extraordinary. Because she had not. That was exactly what made it unusual. Kindness had become so rare that seeing it without any expectation of reward felt unforgettable. Across the city, my morning began much differently. My alarm sounded at 6. I rolled out of bed before it rang a second time. My father was already awake in the living room. The television played quietly, while he sorted through a collection of crossword puzzles. Ever since his health problems forced him into early retirement, mornings had become his favorite part of the day. "You are up early," he said. I smiled. "Says the man who never sleeps." He laughed softly. The sound made me happy every time I heard it. A year earlier there were days when I worried I might lose him. Now he looked stronger. Not perfect, but stronger. That was enough. I prepared breakfast, organized his medication, and left for work. The bookstore occupied a quiet corner between a bakery and a flower shop. It was not glamorous. It was not impressive. But I loved it. The scent of paper and coffee greeted me every morning. Customers wandered through shelves searching for stories. Children sat in reading corners. Elderly regulars discussed novels as if they were close friends. It felt like one of the few peaceful places left in the city. Around noon, a customer accidentally dropped a stack of books while reaching for a title on a high shelf. Before anyone else reacted, I hurried over to help. The woman looked embarrassed. "I am so sorry." "Do not worry about it," I said, gathering the books. "These things happen." She smiled gratefully. 10 minutes later, I helped another customer find a gift for his granddaughter. Then I carried a heavy box for one of my coworkers. None of it seemed important. It was simply how I moved through the day. What I did not know was that someone was watching again. Across the street, Vincent sat inside a black sedan waiting for a meeting to begin. Through the bookstore window, he recognized me immediately. The same woman from the train. For a moment he thought it had to be a coincidence. Chicago was a large city. Yet there I was, helping customers with the same quiet patience he remembered. He watched as I handed a book to an elderly customer and walked her carefully toward the register. He watched as I smiled at a nervous child searching for a school reading assignment. He watched for nearly 5 minutes before his driver spoke. "Sir." Vincent blinked. "Yes. We are going to be late." Vincent glanced at the bookstore one final time before looking away. "Right." The car pulled from the curb and disappeared into traffic. Yet for the second time in less than 24 hours, the image of one ordinary woman followed him long after she was gone. And for reasons he still could not explain, he found himself hoping fate would give him another chance to see her. Some people carry their burdens so quietly that the world never notices how heavy they are. I had become one of those people. The weeks passed quickly after the second time Vincent saw me. My routine never changed. Work, home, groceries, doctor appointments, bills. Repeat. There was comfort in the predictability. There was also exhaustion. Most evenings I arrived home with barely enough energy to think. Yet I never complained. Not because life was easy, because complaining never solved anything. One rainy Thursday, I left the bookstore later than usual. A delivery had arrived hours behind schedule, and my manager needed help organizing inventory before closing. By the time I stepped outside, the streets glistened beneath reflections of city lights. Cars moved through puddles. Umbrellas drifted along crowded sidewalks. I checked my phone and immediately frowned. 3 missed calls from my father. My heart tightened. I called him back instantly. "Dad, relax," he said before I could ask a question. "Everything is fine." I exhaled. "You know I hate when you do that." He laughed softly. "I just wanted to remind you that tomorrow is my appointment." I closed my eyes. "I know. You have work. I will figure it out. Olivia." His voice became gentler. "You do not have to rearrange your entire life every time I need something." I smiled sadly. That is exactly what daughters are supposed to do. When the call ended, I stood beneath the awning for a moment watching rain fall across the street. Then I walked toward the train station. Across the city, Vincent sat inside a conference room surrounded by executives discussing numbers worth millions of dollars. Charts filled screens. Presentations continued. People talked endlessly about expansion, acquisitions, and strategy. Normally, Vincent dominated these conversations. Tonight he barely listened. His thoughts wandered elsewhere. Earlier that afternoon, he had passed the bookstore again. Through the window, he saw Olivia helping a customer choose books for a child recovering from surgery. The conversation lasted only minutes. Yet the image remained with him. There was something unusual about her. Not perfection. Not innocence. something stronger. She moved through the world with quiet generosity despite carrying responsibilities most people would find overwhelming. The next afternoon, fate intervened again. Olivia accompanied her father to a medical appointment across town. The waiting room was crowded. Nurses moved quickly between patients. Families filled every available chair. While waiting, Olivia noticed a young mother struggling to keep two energetic children occupied. One little boy sat on the floor looking frustrated. Tears threatened to appear. Without hesitation, Olivia reached into her bag and removed a children's adventure novel from the bookstore. "Would you like to borrow this?" she asked. The boy's face immediately brightened. His mother looked relieved. "That is very kind of you." Olivia smiled. "It is only a book." 20 feet away, another visitor happened to witness the entire exchange. Vincent had arrived unexpectedly to meet someone associated with a charitable healthcare project. The moment he entered the waiting room, he recognized her. Again, for several seconds he simply watched. Not because she was trying to attract attention, because she never was. Every time he saw her, she was helping someone who could offer nothing in return. The realization settled heavily in his thoughts. People often revealed their true character when nobody important was watching. Olivia did not know Vincent Romano existed. She certainly did not know he was nearby. Yet she remained exactly the same person every single time. As Olivia walked her father toward the parking garage later that afternoon, she never noticed the man standing near the hospital entrance. Vincent watched her disappear into the crowd. Then he smiled slightly, because for the third time, fate had placed the same woman directly in his path. And he was beginning to believe that was no coincidence. The people who change your life rarely announce their arrival. Sometimes they simply keep appearing until fate becomes impossible to ignore. A few days after the hospital visit, life returned to its usual rhythm. I worked. I helped my father. I paid bills. Nothing extraordinary happened. At least that was what I believed. The truth was that someone else's attention was slowly becoming a part of my story. Saturday mornings were usually my favorite. The bookstore opened later, which meant I could spend extra time with my father before work. That particular morning, sunlight filled our small apartment. The smell of coffee drifted through the kitchen. For the first time in weeks, my father looked genuinely relaxed. We sat together discussing a mystery novel he had just finished. "The ending was terrible," he announced confidently. "You say that about every book. Because half of them deserve it." I laughed. Moments like those felt precious. They reminded me that happiness often lived inside ordinary routines. Later that afternoon, the bookstore became unusually busy. A community reading event had attracted families from across the neighborhood. Children filled the aisles. Parents searched for recommendations. Volunteers moved tables and decorations. The entire place felt alive. Around 3 o'clock, an elderly customer entered carrying a cardboard box. She looked overwhelmed. Before she could ask for help, I walked over. "Would you like a hand with that?" Relief immediately crossed her face. "Please." Together, we carried the box toward the back room. Inside were donated books for a literacy program. For nearly 20 minutes, I helped sort and organize everything. When we finished, the woman thanked me repeatedly. "You have a good heart." I smiled politely. I was happy to help. To me, the moment felt insignificant. To someone watching through the front window, it was not. Vincent had arrived at a nearby restaurant for a business lunch. As he stepped from his car, he happened to glance toward the bookstore across the street. Then he stopped walking. There I was again, helping someone. Not performing. Not seeking attention. Simply helping. His driver noticed. "Sir." Vincent remained focused on the bookstore. "Do you believe in coincidence?" The driver considered the question. "Sometimes." Vincent looked through the glass one moment longer. Then he shook his head slightly. "I am starting to have doubts." That evening, fate pushed our paths even closer together. After closing, I stopped at a neighborhood grocery store. My shopping basket contained little more than essentials: bread, milk, soup, medication. I carefully calculated prices while moving through the aisles. Every dollar mattered. Near the checkout line, I noticed a young mother quietly removing items from her cart. A little girl beside her looked disappointed. The woman checked her wallet before placing several groceries back onto a shelf. I hesitated. Then I stepped forward. "Excuse me." She looked surprised. "Yes." I held out a store gift card that had been sitting unused in my purse for months. "I think this still has money on it." Her eyes widened. "I cannot take that. Please." The little girl smiled hopefully. After a long pause, the woman accepted. Gratitude filled her expression. I paid for my groceries and left before she could say much more. What I never noticed was another customer standing several registers away. Vincent watched the entire interaction. Once again, nobody knew he was there. Once again, Olivia Parker walked away from a good deed as if it meant nothing. Vincent stood silently for several seconds after she disappeared through the automatic doors. Then a realization settled into his thoughts. He had spent years meeting powerful people, influential people, successful people. Yet somehow, the person who impressed him most was a bookstore employee who believed kindness should remain anonymous. And for the first time, he decided that watching from a distance was no longer enough. Being kind is easy when it costs nothing. The real test comes when kindness asks you to sacrifice something you cannot afford to lose. I learned that lesson a few days later. The month had already been difficult. My father's medical expenses had increased. Rent was due soon. The bookstore had reduced employee hours because business had slowed. Every calculation in my notebook ended with the same uncomfortable conclusion. I needed more money than I had. Still, life continued. Monday afternoon arrived with gray skies and steady rain. The bookstore remained quiet for most of the day. Around 4 o'clock, my manager called me into the office. The expression on her face immediately worried me. "Olivia, please sit down." My stomach tightened. Those words rarely led to good news. She sighed before speaking. "Corporate has decided to reduce staffing again." I already knew where the conversation was heading. How many hours? 10 per week. For a moment I simply stared at her. 10 hours represented nearly a quarter of my monthly income. The number echoed inside my head while I tried to remain calm. My manager looked genuinely upset. I fought against it. I nodded. "I know. The decision was not her fault." That did not make it easier. When my shift ended, I stepped outside into the rain and stood beneath the bookstore awning. Cars passed. People hurried home. Nobody noticed the woman silently trying to figure out how to make impossible numbers work. I eventually started walking toward the train station. Halfway there, I passed a small community center. Through the front window, I recognized several volunteers preparing food boxes for local families. Normally, I stopped to help when time allowed. Tonight, I almost kept walking. Almost. Then I saw an older volunteer struggling to carry supplies alone. Without thinking, I changed direction and walked inside. For the next hour, I helped organize donations and load boxes into storage rooms. Nobody paid me. Nobody promised future opportunities. Yet somehow, helping others eased the weight on my own shoulders. As I prepared to leave, one volunteer smiled warmly. "You always show up when someone needs help." I laughed softly. Not always. More often than most. I left before the compliment could make me uncomfortable. Across town, Vincent sat inside a charity board meeting reviewing community support initiatives. One report mentioned the very same center. Curious, he asked questions about recent volunteer efforts. A coordinator smiled. "There is one young woman who helps whenever she can." Vincent barely reacted outwardly. "What is her name?" "Olivia Parker." The answer landed with surprising force. Even here. Even when nobody important was watching. Even when her own life was becoming harder. She continued helping people. Later that evening, Vincent stood alone in his office overlooking the city. Rain streaked across the glass windows. Chicago lights shimmered below like scattered stars. His phone buzzed with messages. Meetings. Contracts. Deadlines. None of them held his attention. Instead, he thought about a bookstore employee who kept giving pieces of herself away despite having so little to spare. Most people became guarded when life grew difficult. Olivia seemed to move in the opposite direction. The harder things became, the more kindness she offered. Meanwhile, I arrived home carrying groceries and a growing list of financial worries. After my father went to sleep, I sat alone at the kitchen table reviewing expenses. Numbers filled page after page. The reality was unavoidable. Something would have to change soon. I closed the notebook and stared out the window into the darkness. What I did not know was that events had already begun moving beyond my control. Somewhere else in the city, Vincent Romano made a quiet decision. For weeks, he had watched kindness leave a trail wherever Olivia Parker went. Now, for the first time, he intended to do something about it. Sometimes miracles do not arrive with fanfare. Sometimes they arrive disguised as coincidence. The week after my hours were reduced at the bookstore, I prepared myself for difficult choices. I updated my budget. I canceled a few unnecessary expenses. I began searching for part-time work during evenings and weekends. The numbers still worried me, but worrying would not pay bills. So I focused on what I could control. Then unexpected things began happening. The first arrived on a Tuesday morning. My manager called me into her office before opening. I immediately feared more bad news. Instead, she smiled. Good news for once. I blinked. That would be a nice change. She laughed. Corporate approved a community outreach program. We need someone to coordinate it. I listened carefully. And I recommended you. My surprise must have been obvious because she smiled wider. It comes with additional hours and better pay. For several seconds I could not find words. The opportunity felt almost too perfectly timed. Are you serious? Very. Relief washed through me so quickly that I nearly laughed. The extra income would not solve every problem, but it would help enormously. When I told my father that evening, he looked genuinely pleased. See, he said. Sometimes life surprises you. I smiled. Maybe. Yet the surprises continued. A few days later, one of my father's specialists called unexpectedly. During a recent review, a healthcare assistance program had become available for certain medications. The savings would significantly reduce monthly expenses. I thanked the coordinator repeatedly. After the call ended, I sat quietly at the kitchen table trying to understand how everything seemed to be improving at once. None of it felt impossible, just unusually fortunate. Across the city, Vincent sat inside his office reviewing reports from several charitable initiatives. One folder rested separately from the others. Olivia Parker. He had not broken rules. He had not manipulated systems. He had simply directed existing programs toward someone who genuinely qualified for help. The bookstore outreach project needed leadership. Olivia was the obvious candidate. The healthcare assistance program already existed. Her father met every requirement. Vincent had merely ensured the right people looked at the application. Nothing more. Yet even that felt strangely personal. His assistant entered carrying documents. You seem distracted lately. Vincent glanced up. Doi. Only slightly. She smiled. That is dramatic by your standards. He almost laughed. The observation was not wrong. For years business decisions came easily. Personal interest in strangers did not. Meanwhile, I continued moving through life completely unaware of the invisible connections surrounding me. The bookstore project became a success almost immediately. Local schools partnered with us. Community organizations participated. Children received books they otherwise might never have owned. Watching their excitement reminded me why I loved the work. One Saturday afternoon, I stood outside the store helping organize donations when a familiar black sedan stopped briefly across the street. I noticed it only because it seemed expensive compared to most cars in the neighborhood. The vehicle remained parked for less than a minute before driving away. I never saw the man inside. Vincent, however, saw me. He watched as I thanked volunteers, carried boxes, and spent nearly half an hour helping a shy little girl choose her first novel. The smile on the child's face stayed with him long after the car moved away. That evening, he stood beside his office window overlooking the Chicago skyline. The city stretched endlessly beneath the night sky. Thousands of lights. Millions of stories. Yet one story occupied his thoughts more than any other. Olivia still did not know his name. She did not know he had noticed her on the train months earlier. She did not know how often their paths had nearly crossed since then. But Vincent was beginning to understand something important. The more he learned about her, the less this felt like simple curiosity. And for the first time, he wondered what might happen if they finally met. The truth has a strange way of appearing when you least expect it. Sometimes it arrives through a conversation, sometimes through a name, and sometimes through a single newspaper headline. Several weeks passed after life began improving. The bookstore project continued growing. My father's health remained stable. For the first time in months, I could breathe without constantly calculating every dollar. Gratitude filled my days. Yet one question occasionally surfaced in the back of my mind. Why had everything changed so suddenly? Every improvement made sense on its own. Together, however, they felt unusually connected. I never found an answer. At least not immediately. One Saturday morning, the bookstore hosted a community literacy fundraiser. Volunteers filled the building. Local business leaders attended. Families wandered between tables and displays. The atmosphere felt cheerful and energetic. Around noon, my manager approached carrying a newspaper. "Look at this," she said. I glanced down. A photograph occupied nearly half the page. The man in the picture looked familiar. Dark suit, confident expression, gray eyes. Something about him immediately caught my attention. Then I saw the name beneath the article. Vincent Romano. My stomach tightened unexpectedly. I had seen him before. Not once. Several times. The hospital waiting room. The bookstore window. The grocery store. Moments I barely remembered suddenly returned with startling clarity. "You know who he is?" my manager asked. I looked back at the article. Not really. Most people in Chicago do. She pointed toward the photograph. His foundation funds half the community programs in this district. I continued reading. The article described charitable projects, educational initiatives, healthcare partnerships, and business investments across the city. The name appeared everywhere. Vincent Romano. I repeated it silently. Somehow, seeing it in print made those brief encounters feel different. More significant. More confusing. The fundraiser continued around me, but my attention drifted. Then something unexpected happened. One of the event coordinators approached carrying additional paperwork. "We just received confirmation from the Romano Foundation." My head lifted immediately. "The what?" "The Romano Foundation." She smiled. "They are expanding support for the literacy project." For several seconds I simply stared at her. A strange feeling settled in my chest. Coincidence suddenly felt less convincing. Later that afternoon, after the event ended, I returned home with a copy of the newspaper. While my father watched television, I sat at the kitchen table rereading the article. Every paragraph raised new questions. Eventually my father noticed. "You have been staring at that page for 20 minutes. I laughed softly. "Maybe." He adjusted his glasses. "Who is it?" I turned the newspaper toward him. The moment he saw the photograph, recognition crossed his face. "Vincent Romano." "You know him?" "Not personally." My father leaned back thoughtfully. "But I know his reputation." "Good or bad?" He smiled. "Mostly good from what I hear." Then he studied me carefully. "Why are you asking?" I hesitated. "I think I have seen him before." My father nodded slowly. People like that usually do not move through ordinary places very often. His observation stayed with me long after the conversation ended. That evening across the city, Vincent attended a foundation meeting. Discussions filled the room. Reports covered educational grants, healthcare programs, and community development projects. Yet part of his attention remained elsewhere. Earlier that day, he had received photographs from the literacy fundraiser. Olivia appeared in several images helping children choose books. The sight made him smile. Then his assistant mentioned something unexpected. "She was asking questions about you." Vincent looked up immediately. For the first time in months, the distance between their separate worlds felt smaller than ever. Because Olivia Parker finally knew his name. And neither of them realized how much that discovery was about to change. Some discoveries answer old questions. Others create entirely new ones. After learning Vincent Romano's name, I told myself I would stop thinking about him. That decision lasted less than 2 days. Everywhere I looked, his name seemed to appear. Articles, community projects, foundation announcements, educational programs. The more I learned, the more confused I became. Nothing matched the image I expected. Powerful people usually enjoyed attention. Vincent appeared to avoid it. Wealthy people often attached their names to every charitable effort. His foundation quietly supported projects without demanding recognition. Most surprising of all, every description painted the same picture. Disciplined, private, respected, generous. Did not make sense. Especially when I remembered all the moments our paths had crossed without a single conversation. Then came the afternoon that changed everything. The bookstore's literacy program had grown so successful that a formal community event was scheduled at a downtown cultural center. Local leaders, educators, donors, and volunteers were invited. My manager insisted I attend. "You helped build this program," she said. "You are going." So on a cool Friday evening, I found myself standing inside one of the most elegant buildings I had ever entered. Crystal lights reflected across polished floors. Large windows overlooked the Chicago skyline. People in formal business attire moved through the room holding conversations that sounded far more important than anything I normally experienced. I felt completely out of place. "Relax," my manager whispered. "You look terrified." "I am terrified." She laughed. "You will survive." I was not so sure. Then the room suddenly grew quieter. Not silent, just different. The subtle shift that happens when someone important enters. Curious, I glanced toward the main entrance. And there he was. Vincent Romano. For the first time I saw him clearly. Not through a bookstore window. Not across a hospital waiting room. Not from a distance. He moved through the crowd with calm confidence. Dark suit. Composed expression. Effortless presence. People greeted him immediately. Yet what surprised me most was how uncomfortable he seemed with the attention. He thanked people politely and continued moving without encouraging the spotlight. Then something unexpected happened. His eyes found mine. Across an entire room filled with hundreds of people, he recognized me instantly. I knew it from the expression that appeared for a brief moment. Recognition. Real recognition. My heart skipped. Vincent paused. Then he started walking toward me. Every instinct told me to look away. Somehow I could not. Seconds later he stood in front of me. Olivia Parker. The sound of my name startled me. "You know who I am?" The question escaped before I could stop it. A faint smile appeared. "Ido." I stared at him. "Have we met?" Vincent's expression softened slightly. "Not officially." For a moment neither of us spoke. Then, something about the situation suddenly felt absurd. "You were on the train." His smile widened. "Yes." "And the hospital." "Yes." "And the bookstore." Another nod. I laughed in disbelief. I thought I was imagining that. "You were not." The honesty in his voice immediately erased any discomfort. Around us, conversations continued. Glasses clinked. Music played softly. Yet for several moments everything else seemed distant. "Can I ask you something?" I said. "Of course." I hesitated before speaking. "Why do I keep running into you?" Vincent considered the question carefully. Then he answered with complete sincerity. "I have been asking myself the same thing." For the first time since discovering his name, I felt something unexpected. Not uncertainty. Not intimidation. Trust. Because standing in front of me was not the powerful man described in newspapers. It was the same stranger who had quietly noticed a small act of kindness months earlier. And somehow, I was beginning to understand why fate kept bringing us together. The most important moments in life rarely feel important while they are happening. Only later do you realize that everything changed because of a single choice, a single conversation, or a single act of kindness. After the event downtown, Vincent and I began talking regularly. Nothing dramatic happened. There were no grand declarations. No impossible promises. Just conversations. Honest ones. Sometimes over coffee. Sometimes during community projects. Sometimes while walking through quiet Chicago streets after long days. The more time we spent together, the more I understood something that newspapers could never explain. Vincent was not defined by his influence, his wealth, or his reputation. He was defined by what he noticed. He noticed struggling families. He noticed forgotten neighborhoods. He noticed people who needed help. And months earlier, he had noticed one tired woman giving up a seat on a crowded train. Winter arrived. Then spring followed. Life continued moving forward. My father's health improved steadily. The bookstore literacy project expanded into neighboring districts. Hundreds of children received books through programs that continued growing every month. Whenever something good happened, I felt grateful. Yet one question remained unanswered. One evening, almost a year after our first silent encounter, Vincent and I stood beside the train platform where everything had started. The city glowed around us. Trains arrived and departed. Commuters hurried past carrying bags, briefcases, and worries of their own. "Can I ask you something?" I said. Vincent smiled. "You usually do." I laughed softly. "Why me?" He looked surprised. "What do you mean?" "Out of all the people in Chicago." I glanced toward the tracks. "Why did you pay attention to me?" For a moment he said nothing. Then he looked toward the arriving train. "Because everyone else looked away." I frowned slightly. Vincent continued. "That night, every person on that train saw the elderly woman." His voice remained calm. "They saw she was struggling. They saw she needed help." He paused. "You were the only person who stood up." The train doors opened. Passengers stepped out. Others stepped in. Life continued around us. Yet neither of us moved. "It was only a seat," I said quietly. Vincent smiled. "That is exactly the point." I looked at him. "I do not understand. Most people think character is revealed during major moments." He shook his head. "I think character is revealed during small ones." The words settled deeply inside me. Then something familiar caught my attention. Near the far end of the platform, an elderly man entered the train carrying several heavy bags. Every seat appeared occupied. For a brief moment, nobody moved. Then a young college student stood and offered his place. The older man smiled gratefully and sat down. I smiled too. Vincent noticed. "What are you thinking?" I watched the train doors close. "Maybe kindness spreads." Vincent followed my gaze. "I think it does." The train disappeared into the night. Wind moved through the station. City lights reflected against the glass structures around us. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then Vincent looked at me with an expression I had come to trust completely. "You changed more lives than you realize, Olivia." I immediately shook my head. "That is not true." "It is." His voice remained gentle. "You changed mine." Emotion tightened my throat unexpectedly. Not because the statement sounded dramatic, because it sounded sincere. And sincerity had always mattered more than grand words. Together, we turned away from the platform and began walking toward the city lights. 1 year earlier, I had given away a seat without thinking twice about it. I never expected anyone to remember. I never expected anyone to notice. Yet that simple choice had started a chain of events that changed everything. Looking back, I finally understood the lesson life had been trying to teach me all along. Kindness is never small. We only think it is because we cannot see how far it travels.